Sustain 267.
Welcome to the second live stream Sustain 267 podcast, where we host conversations on climate change and sustainability in Africa. I am your host, Gillian, and I'll be co-hosting with Jeremy again. Hey, Jeremy.
Hey.
Sustain 267 podcast in partnership with Global Shapers Community Climate and Environment Steering Committee, Sub-Saharan Africa, which is made up of Kamal, who's our regional lead, Gerald, who is the regional lead for North Africa, Jeremy, who leads East Africa, and myself, I lead Southern Africa, with hubs Abuja, Accra, Durban, Gaborone, Nairobi, Lagos, and Victoria, including the Environmentally Friendly Initiative, bring you the second episode of the Climate Talk series. This is a 6-month webinar series aimed at fostering knowledge and sharing on challenges and solutions to climate change and environmental issues through the lenses of Africans. Through this, we'll also be looking at encouraging collaborations across the continent, across different entities, and among different people addressing environmental issues on our beautiful continent. I'll now be handing over to my co-host, Jeremy, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Pato, for that brilliant introduction. And thank you so much for our brilliant panelists for making time for us today. I also want to take the chance to thank everybody behind the scenes, the Global Shapers hubs that have been mentioned, and of course for Global Shapers and other people making time to attend this meeting. So before I go into introductions, just a kind reminder, you can comment on Facebook and you can also ask questions in our Zoom chat if you're joining us through Zoom. So let's jump straight into introductions. First up, we have Ms. Angelique Pouponneau. She's the CEO of the Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust, SECAT. She has a passion for advancing the sustainable use and conservation of our oceans. She was born and grew up in one of Seychelles' fishing districts, Belom, where she gained a first-hand perspective on the importance of preserving marine resources. Angelique is a lawyer trained in Seychelles and the UK, and she holds an LLM in environmental law, specializing in the law of the sea and natural resources law. Angelique is also trained as a climate change negotiator through the Alliance of Small Island States Climate Change Fellowship Program at the United Nations. Angelique has worked in different countries in the Caribbean, Pacific, and the Indian Ocean on a wide range of projects relating to sustainable fisheries, sustainable management of marine biodiversity within and beyond national jurisdiction, and climate change, in particular climate adaptation and climate finance. Furthermore, she has served as a legal expert of the African group of the 6th Committee in works of ocean and law of the sea at the United Nations, and has a wealth of experience working with civil society as a co-founder for a non-profit organization in Seychelles and a board member of a Commonwealth-wide youth-led organization. Next up, we have Ms. Amy Gillian, and she is the African Reality Project Branch Manager. Amy started her career as a researcher at the Center for Study of Governance Innovation at the University of Pretoria. Since then, she has had the privilege of working with Amnesty International and more recently, the African branch of the Climate Reality Project. Amy's academic background started with degrees in international relations from the University of Pretoria and eventually led to a master's in sustainable development from the Sustainable Institute in Stellenbosch. A thesis evaluated the impact of agroecology training on smallholders' adaptability to climate change impacts. Through her research, Amy developed a passion for sustainable food systems, regenerative agriculture, and empowering smallholder farmers through skills training. Amy is equally passionate about environmental and social justice issues, gender equity, and the importance of climate education and literacy. Finally, Amy believes in putting her passion for sustainable living into practice by incorporating it into as many areas of her life as possible. She follows a plant-based diet, lives in a small holding outside of Johannesburg, where she grows some of her vegetables and raises a flock of chickens who eat her food waste. Lastly, we have Dr. Habiba Ahut Daggash, and she's a researcher at the Imperial College of London, where she completed her PhD at the Grantham Institute, Climate Change and the Environment. Her research sought to understand how power systems need to transition to help deliver the Paris Agreement, with a focus on the UK and Nigeria. Dr. Habiba completed both her bachelor's and master's degrees at the University of Oxford, where she specialized in chemical engineering. She's the immediate and past chair of the ICAM Energy Center's Future Leadership Group and served on the board of the center. She's an associate member of the ICAM Energy Institute. Dr. Habiba is interested in implications of climate change mitigation objectives on energy system transitions within the context of geopolitical and biophysical constraints. She has published articles on the potential of carbon dioxide removal technologies in decarbonizing transport and power sectors of the UK, long-term energy system transitions in Nigeria, and priorities for policy design and to support the commercialization of greenhouse gas removal methods. So a warm welcome to all our panelists. And just so you know, we have asked for multi-sectoral perspectives. So each person we have today will be representing academia, funding, NGO across the continent. And without further ado, I want to just ask a general question. So we'll start off with the order of Angelique, going to Amy, going to Dr. Habiba. And if we can keep our answers to about a minute, 2 minutes, the first question that we have to ask generally is, what does climate action mean to you? And what role do you play towards advocating for its acceleration, and acceleration of it in your country and Sub-Saharan Africa?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for that very interesting question, and one, that brings it home from the get-go. What does climate action mean to me? So from my perspective, given that climate change is such a global challenge, a global concern, something that should matter to everyone. When it comes to climate action, I also see it as a need for collective action, and one that everyone has to do their part, regardless how big or how small it is, and at various levels. So whether it's at grassroots, national or international level. Right now, as the CEO of SECAT, I have the opportunity to be part of a financing body that finances climate action, and being able to really provide different people and from different sections of society the ability to take climate action and to be part of the solution is what I'm doing for climate action. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I think I would agree with much of what Angelique has said already, and just add that for me, climate action really is, beyond incorporating it into my daily life at very much at an individual level. Climate action is also about participation. At the end of the day, it's each and every single one of us participating in the decisions that affect us, in the way in which policies are implemented, holding our governments accountable. And I think civic participation and engagement in democratic processes is absolutely essential for climate ambition, for raising climate ambition. So I would add that on to what Angelique was saying, because I think so much of what she said is very much, covers many of the feelings I have and thoughts around climate action. And then in terms of the way in which I facilitate climate action within my job is, as the branch manager, we work with a network of climate reality leaders really right across Africa. And thanks to 2 virtual trainings this year, that network has really extended to over, I think it's 1,500 leaders at the moment. And so it's really about facilitating that awareness raising, facilitating those conversations, that action through the use of or providing different materials, different information, knowledge. So when it comes to different campaigns, we really put resources together, we bring people together and help them in mobilizing and taking climate action in their local communities to start these conversations and hopefully take that forward.
So I absolutely agree with the previous 2 speakers, but just to discuss a bit about my personal role in climate action is, I guess I work at the step before the climate action happens, which is knowledge creation and mainstreaming that knowledge. I think initially, before I started my research, I found that we broadly agree that Africa is vulnerable to climate change, but the underlying data to actually understand how the impacts will play out at a local or rural level is largely absent. And also the knowledge to enable governments, particularly policymakers, to be able to design policies that include climate action, so mainstreaming climate action into development planning, is largely missing. So from my work in the power, looking at the power sector, my role in climate action is making that knowledge available that enables decision makers to be able to carry out critical decisions that lead to a sustainable energy transition, but one that's also equitable in a region that already is plagued by many vulnerabilities.
All right, thank you for that. And then my next question, actually, all three of you for the most part touched on participation. So currently the COVID-19 pandemic is on and it's affected all of us. And it's seen everyone participate in taking action against a common cause. So my question, maybe Habiba, you could chip in here. Do you think COVID-19 will slow down climate action in Sub-Saharan Africa, or does it present an opportunity to transform society and possibly accelerate meaningful change?
So I think it really depends on the critical decisions that are made now by governments that are trying to restructure and reform to deal with this post-pandemic paradigm that we are now facing. COVID-19 is a huge opportunity to redirect, just starting from the global scale. We've seen that the economic downturn has led to a lot of stimulus, particularly in the developed world, and that the countries, particularly the EU, the US, are taking advantage of this pandemic to direct that stimulus spending towards greener sectors of the economy. That global shift could also incentivize our Sub-Saharan African countries to do the same, as they do receive support in trying to cope with the recessions that I think are now widespread across the world. It is up to our government, our decision makers, to decide to direct that investment towards greener sectors of the economy. And there is a huge potential there, but there is always the chance that that opportunity will not be taken. And unfortunately, we see that so often in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm just going to use one example, which is the oil and gas industry. I think that puts it into context that the economic downturn and the oversupply within the oil market has created a low price environment. So we see the producer economies, Nigeria, Angola, who have been so reliant on oil revenues, facing an economic crisis. And now we have the choice to be able to then redirect efforts towards developing or diversifying our economies, as opposed to trying to hoping that the oil price recovers and that we can keep relying on the fossil fuel sector to drive development. It really is about high-level decision-making and choices, which is why it's important. The advocacy side of the equation is really important to ensure that policymakers always have climate action within their minds as they're making some of these crucial decisions.
Definitely, it's a potential opportunity, but it's not in the bag yet. We could potentially lose it if we don't use it. And then Angelique, speaking to you as someone who's a donor or funder, we've seen a lot of funds being, well, we've seen COVID-19 using a lot of funds that were potentially unbudgeted for by a lot of governments. And we've seen some donors having to create a fund for that. What impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on climate action donor funding? What have you seen from your end?
Thanks for that question. And just to build on what's just been said by Habiba, it's very, I think there's definitely a strong case to be made that we do need to ensure that there are good high-level decisions made where the funds are channeled to climate action. I think there's also another opportunity from the donors' end. When you're thinking about, because we've seen it, right? I don't know how much debt your country has taken on since COVID-19, but where young people are going to be facing, I don't know how many injustices, because you're going to be born into debt, you're going to be inheriting debt for the longest time, and on top of that, you're going to be but in the brunt of a climate crisis. So I do wonder how donors themselves are also providing those options of being of when they're providing these debt instruments or loans and so on, that there are actually sustainability goals and targets tied to that and linked to climate action. Otherwise, again, such a double injustice, born into debt, facing a climate crisis, and on so much uncertainty. So from a donor's perspective, SECAT, my organization, was born out of such financial deals where a debt was linked to sustainability targets. And because we are not dependent on economic activities that have been crippled by COVID-19, such as tourism, we are the ones who today are able to still continue to sustain and sustainably finance climate action, because we've gone the innovative way, right? We've gone for restructuring a debt with sustainability targets and not being entirely dependent on tourism. So I do want to put it out there that donors also have to be more innovative, and they also need to move away of just thinking of a return on investment, but also think about climate change and the survival of humanity.
Oh, that's quite brilliant, taking that whole initiative of not being at risk of some things. And then the next question would be, you touched on government having potential and government having a potential opportunity. What can we then, as young people, because most of the people on this call are young people, what can we do to draw government's attention and encourage them towards taking climate change as we recover? Angelique, and then maybe Amy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm currently in the Seychelles like Jeremy, and we're smack in the middle of election campaigning. Never a quiet moment anymore in this country. But what I think is absolutely necessary is that young people use their voting power, the people's power, and really make climate change a political issue. Because unless you do that, and I ask this question all the time to the crowd, would you, does it bother you, or would you go and vote for somebody who doesn't have climate change in their manifesto? Is it that important to you? Is that a critical criteria that you think about when you go and vote? And unless we make it one, then we're never going to see that pressure on the politicians or the decision makers, because again, they're politicians. They think in 5-year cycles. They're just trying to get to the next election. So I think we really need to make climate change a political issue internationally. It's obviously one. We need to make it so nationally.
Yeah, and then from our end in Botswana, we actually saw it make an appearance in political party manifestos for the first time last year when we went to the polls. I think our current leading party had 5 sentences on it. It was 5 from 0. So hopefully in the next election cycle, we'll see it go up to a bit more sentences. Amy, maybe if you could touch on that, on what young people can do to encourage government to engage in climate action. But not only that, what have you seen work as being an NGO?
Sure, thanks, Fata. And I think just adding on to what Angelique was saying, because I think it really connects to the point that I wanted to share, is that I think, not only as young people, but as society as a whole, is that if we can start connecting the conversation around climate change to human rights and applying a human rights lens and framework and perspective to the issue of climate change, that I think we start to shift from a conversation where it's only about the environment, which for so many decades has how it's been interpreted, to seeing a human face on the issue. And I think by doing that, by adding a human rights perspective and lens to climate change, that you naturally are going to escalate the issue up the political agenda, because human rights is an issue that politicians, that governments, that society as a whole cares about much more than when we only talk about the environment, unfortunately, and depending on different groups and different societies. But I think human rights really, when we use that language and that lens and that frameworks, it brings us together. And, it turns it into something that becomes, where states and governments have legally binding obligations that they're actually being held accountable. Because, for instance, in the South African context, what we've seen is, when you start to bring the language within our constitution into the conversation, the fact that we have a right to a safe and healthy environment, and by virtue of the fact that you are allowing pollution levels to go up, or by virtue of the fact that you are favoring the development of another mine, at the expense of a community and their rights to say no, and their rights to a healthy and safe environment, I think definitely elevates the issue and grabs people's attention. And I think our youth are particularly important in that. And I think that's even more reason to have youth involved in our democratic processes. So yes, it's voting on one hand, but on the other hand, it's, what are your rights as a citizen in a democracy? And then on the other side of that is, what are your responsibilities as a citizen in a democracy? And what are the processes and the mechanisms with which you need to engage, whether it's government, whether it's public finance institutions, multilateral development banks, and even private companies on rights. And I think right across Africa, we have seen how when we have weak land rights, for instance, that you have land grabs taking place. And often it's indigenous communities, like the Maasai in Tanzania, right? And their land rights are undermined, but at the expense of biodiversity, at the expense of these natural systems where indigenous groups have looked after these amazing systems, have lived within these systems for centuries. So for me, I think it really, it's applying that human rights lens and really incorporating that into the climate action that we take, whether it's as youth, as civil society as a whole. And I think in South Africa, we are seeing more and more of that happening, and the conversations around a just transition, because it's making it more relatable to people's circumstances on the ground.
And then when you talk about we need to expand the climate change conversation, I remember yesterday, I attended something and someone said something that really stuck with me so much, I tweeted it. She said, we need to stop making climate change an environmental conversation. So I was like, snap, yep. So that's something that really stood out to me. Habiba, do you want to chip in on how youth can encourage government to act on climate?
I think just to expand on what Amy just spoke about, applying a human rights lens, I think two other perspectives that can be taken are security perspective and an economic perspective as well. There is a long history of a link between environmental damage and conflict. Within Nigeria, we've seen the oil pollution leading to militancy. We've seen currently in 2020, we have floods or droughts in different parts of the country, affecting economic livelihoods, and we're seeing crime levels soar. So viewing climate change as potentially key to national security, I think is also an important link that needs to be established in public discourse, that when environmental disasters do occur, they tend to create a vicious cycle between conflict. And this is particularly important in countries or in regions that have already intertribal or interethnic tensions. Triggers such as environmental disasters serve as a trigger to reignite age-old conflict. So I think applying that lens, and there's already an established evidence base for that link between environmental disaster and conflict and insecurity, needs to be brought to the fore in high-level discussions and also in public discourse. And the second, obviously, the economic damage, particularly when a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa is reliant on subsistence agriculture. They need stability in weather patterns to be able to plan their economic livelihoods. What we are seeing is the extreme rainfall or droughts in somewhere like Nigeria is causing a loss of agricultural output and then increasing poverty levels. So being able to highlight that discussion, I think at a government level, being able to link climate change to those phenomena will be very important in accelerating climate action. Thank you.
Excellent answers. I don't know if you've been seeing, but my head has been nodding very strongly. Somebody coming back from a background of security studies, and especially looking at this in a holistic area, I cannot agree with this more in the sense of we do have existing means. It could be a vote. It could be understanding our rights, using our constitution in these cases. And I think as young people, as active citizens, I think it's all about really understanding what the existing measures are there. So amazing answers around, and something that's particularly has been risen around the region that I'm basically facilitating leadership on is the East African crude oil pipeline, and maybe we'll get to touch on this, but maybe that's just a start to this next question. So just going back to Amy, I think what I want to try and suss out, and maybe we can touch on this pipeline, but what are the major challenges that slow down climate action in your home country? And then just adding on, what are the challenges that cut across the region and across the continent in general?
Thanks, Jeremy. So that is quite a big question. So I think feel free for the other panel speakers to chip in. But I think just speaking from a South African perspective is, I think that particularly during COVID-19, we've seen how so many civil society organizations, academia have come together. And, I think there's so much knowledge already about what the solutions are and what we need to be doing. And I would argue potentially that right now, the biggest holdup is lack of political will, and potentially the concept and notion that profit is more important. GDP measures are more important than any other development indicators. And I completely agree with what Habiba was saying, is that it is absolutely like a security issue. And I think that just if we take a step back and look at climate change, it's essentially a developmental issue because it will affect every single aspect of development. However, the problem is, and even in presenting to some of our political party members last year with a colleague, that they don't see that and they don't understand that, and they don't see that link. And so I think amongst our politicians, but really at various levels, from local municipalities right up to national government, that there's firstly a lack of understanding, I would argue, in terms of what the real challenges are when it comes to climate change and how it affects all of these different developmental areas. And then I think a lack of political will, and that could be for a variety of reasons, whether it's corruption or whether it's due to pursuing profit and I would say mainstream developmental objectives and goals, which say that you should totally go into one of our poorest communities and create a road that divides the community and build a new mine there when the community is saying no. So for me, that would probably be the biggest barrier in South Africa. And I think then if you look regionally or across the continent, I would say that's definitely the sort of feedback we get from a lot of climate leaders, is often a lack of political will. And potentially I would add is also sometimes limited climate literacy. And I think that's also an issue in South Africa, is that people might have an understanding of climate change, but not necessarily understand how it relates to them, their community, their life. So I would say that, and awareness is the first step to taking action, because the more you realize and understand how it affects you, then I think you're more likely to take that action. And the third point I would add to that is to say that, working at Amnesty International last year, I was based at the Southern Africa Regional Office, and it was a fascinating time for me, really being exposed to so many of these issues. And I think what we're seeing in many African countries, and potentially not only in Africa, but in many countries across the world, is, you know, while we're opening up in many ways and having, you know, greater access to more information through technology, at the same time, there's a shrinking of civil space. So many governments clamping down on your ability to free speech and to freedom of speech. And so we've seen so many human rights defenders or environmental defenders right across Africa who are standing up for their rights, who are standing up for the environment, but who are being chased or persecuted as a result of that. And I think that's also a problem in South Africa, but probably not, you know, as explicit. So I think those would be the three key areas that I would say are big barriers.
Great. Angelique, would you like to come in and then maybe Dr. Habiba after that?
I think Amy's done a really great job as bringing it all together and exploring those various reasons why there are barriers to climate action. So it's perhaps I'll just re-emphasize the part about the balance between development and environmental sustainability, and the way in which we've looked at it for so long. We've always seen that they cannot coexist. It's because of the way we've seen business done in the past. We've seen that profit has been generated at the expense of ecological sustainability. And when you come from a small island like Seychelles, for example, you know, we obviously are small island developing states, very vulnerable to climate change. But at the same time, one of the, you know, very sensitive issues would be to bring up the carbon footprint of tourism, which is one of our main industries. And it's a tough one, right? It's getting people to think, how do we still generate an income while and obviously take care of one's people, whilst at the same time having ecological sustainability, which is at the very core of everything. So I think those decisions have often been made in a very linear way, very one or the other. And no one's thinking really outside the box, or just getting rid of the box and coming up with ways in which we can have sustainability and profit and ensure that they coexist. So I think the way of thinking is really one of the main barriers to climate action, in particular when we're thinking about development.
So before I give my response, I'll just add something onto what Amy said about GDP being used as a metric. And I think it brings to the fore the importance of natural capital valuation. I think I don't like the idea of having to put the value on a forest or having to put the value of biodiversity, but within the current economic paradigm, it's important to, those valuation mechanisms need to happen so that there is an incentive to maintain natural capital and to expand them. And I think under the Paris Agreement, there are some mechanisms that are looking at trying to incentivize forest, to reverse forest degradation, improve biodiversity. And I think there's a great role for international climate finance to be able to provide those incentives, because domestically, the resources financially are just not available. And now just more broadly thinking about why climate action is hindered in somewhere like Nigeria. And I would say within like my field, which is the energy space, you can't divorce climate change mitigation from the broader economic crisis happening within the country. And those are fed by both systemic and institutional inefficiencies, corruption, and so on and so forth, all the issues. Within the power sector, there's a huge issue of, even when poor market design and poor institutional design, the means, the incentives are aligned so to discourage any action or progressive action within the space. And I think that's a more general issue that takes us back to the conversation about young people and voting power, and getting people who are willing to undertake reforms to systems, to institutions, to be able to advance broader economic, progressive economic policies, but also particularly those that are relating to climate action as well.
Taking from what you just said on the economies, and there's a lot we've been saying about money and how governments are now having to pivot some of the funds that they then had. Angelique, what allows you, if someone is looking to do a project and they're looking for funding, what allows you to better provide climate finance? So what should people who want to take climate action be aware of as they look for finance? And what are maybe some of the pit stops that they need to avoid? Where could they potentially lose that fund?
Thanks. So, no, that's a great question. And obviously we have a set list of criteria that we assess applications of, but I think one of the really important issues that we consider when evaluating projects, especially those linked to climate change, is the involvement of vulnerable groups and different community groups and different community actors. I think that's always important, because if we're going to have, whether it's a sustainable solution or a just transition, as you know, it's been mentioned earlier, we need to have these groups involved. And then the other issue with financing climate action is also certain limitation with the donors themselves, and that's, you know, that includes even my organization, where the project life is for 2 years, and that's a real issue when you're dealing with climate change. You know, there are some donors that have mechanism, and you know, SECAD is one of them, that just isn't fit enough to be funding these long-term sustainable solutions to climate. So what we're currently investing the most in is this education aspect that really goes to the heart to a lot of what Amy's been saying and Habiba has been saying, that we need people to understand the issue, and then they will go on to take action. And that has been more legacy investments that we've been able to do because of our own limitations. Of course, we're also driven by our own donors' requests and so on, but community involvement and just legacy type projects that can go on beyond the life of the funding is very important.
And then you touched on, taking off what you said about, for people to get funding, they need to include vulnerable groups, they need to include, I think earlier Amy touched on indigenous groups. And then another word that we hear a lot within the climate change, within climate change activism, is grassroots. But then there's the challenge that I think we can all acknowledge of funding not filtering right down to the people at grassroots level, who can be argued that do a lot of heavy lifting. So they'll come on as volunteers, or their project will come on to be shown and told about, but they aren't getting the actual funding. How can that be navigated? Habiba, Amy? Don't all speak at once.
So I have no background in accessing donor finance, so I'm not sure I can speak to this question particularly.
Okay.
Perhaps Amy can.
So yeah, I'll jump in. Thanks, Habiba. So I think it's, you know, it's a very important question, Pato, and I think it's one that all of us are grappling with, because I think there is often that mismatch between, you know, the donors who are looking to fund projects, but then also people on the ground who are trying to secure the funds. And yeah, I think it's an interesting one, and you know, is particularly relevant, I think, in, you know, South Africa, but right across Africa. I don't know necessarily what the solution is, because for me, this is a very new area in terms of climate finance, in terms of donor funding. I do think that's potentially what organizations could do that receive funding, but then also working with, whether it's volunteers or whether it's groups on different levels, right? So for instance, if we had to take you know, something even like Climate Reality Project or ACRP, where we have different groups working right across the region, is that potentially it is allocating part of those funds to groups. So whether it's like a group within East Africa or North Africa, West Africa, to carry out some of the activities. And I think that while that's not the perfect solution right now, that allows for a bridging of that gap. Because often I think what we find with volunteers is that, it's not only their time that they're investing in carrying out the activities or the actions, but it's also potentially like if they want to do a tree planting, where realistically, where does that money come from to pay for the tree saplings, for the compost, for potentially materials that go into that. So I do think it's about having that trickle down effect with the network of people that you're working with. But I think that also requires a degree of then transparency and accountability between organizations, between the people that they're working with, and being very clear on those expectations, because I think being clear is being kind after all, with each other, in doing this work. So yeah, I don't know if that is the perfect solution or answer that you were looking for. I think that off the top of my head is, I think the best that I have come to learn in doing the work that we're doing at the moment is looking at where the opportunities to support people with the best that we can at the moment.
Can I now invite in the audience, the participants of the webinar? Please go ahead and ask questions. You should see a Q&A button. Please go ahead. So the first one is here from Chiugu, and it reads, I think this one is to the full panel. So maybe if we could just have one person off the panel answer each one, so we can squeeze in as many as we can at once. So Chiugu says, African governments are currently battling with the health and economic issues related to COVID-19. Some natural resource dependent economies are currently entering into production agreements with companies that may be economically unfavorable in the long term to respond to depleting national budgets. The question is, to what extent is climate change a priority to these countries, and how can we go beyond dry activism to fruitful system change? So how do we move from just dry, ineffective or small impact activism to actually changing systems? And then while you think about that, here's one from Habiba from Ibukun, and it says, are there any climate change and advocacy programs currently running in Nigeria? And what has your experience been like working with the Nigerian government on these? So those are the two that we'll take for now, and then we'll do another round of questions. Habiba, do you want to take yours first, seeing as that one is directed at you? Yeah.
So I'm happy to go. So yeah, there's a few climate change advocacy programs running across Sub-Saharan Africa and in Nigeria. There's the International Climate Change Development Initiative that tries to mainstream, does a lot of public engagement on climate change knowledge and does climate literacy. There are smaller initiatives that look at plastic pollution or other impacts, not just climate change, but more broadly environmental and damage and disasters. And I'd be happy if I could send her maybe directly a few links, but it's still at a very small scale. I think that's what I'll say. Climate change is very much relegated to the bottom of the priority list within just, I think, public minds, and which brings us back to our conversation on making the link between climate change and other aspects of the economy and livelihoods is really important. And then that can be upscaled. The Minister of Environment was recently discussing the establishment of a youth coalition or a council on climate change. So hopefully that will bring to, that will give visibility to a few of these climate change advocacy groups and can create a national dialogue amongst young people on climate change as well in Nigeria.
And then Amy, seeing as you're from the activism, you're from the NGO and activism part, to what extent is climate change a priority, and how do we go from just activism to actually changing systems?
Sure. So I guess again, it depends on how it's framed. I think if it's framed as a developmental issue that's going to have substantial human rights and human security issues, then it does elevate it and make it more of a priority. So I think in terms of that part of the question, I would say it should be a big priority for those countries. And then going beyond dry activism, I think particularly in terms of that question, I think that's where consumers come into the conversation, that it's really important that we start placing pressure on companies and holding them accountable, because in doing so, that we're able then to change their value chains and the way that they do business in the world around us. So it's not only holding governments accountable, but also holding companies and corporations accountable for the way in which they do business.
Another question coming in here from Fuad, and they say climate action looks more like a qualitative issue. How do we quantify actions to aid more actions? Maybe if you could come in there, Angelique.
Yeah, that's an interesting interesting question, and it's a challenging one, I think, in terms of being able to quantify climate action, because in the climate change space, the most effective way to quantify climate action is the mitigation target. When it comes to, you know, bringing down your carbon emissions, and you know, I put on my lawyer hat for a moment, and I think there's a real opportunity by everyone, and especially youth, to do things like public interest litigation. So I think in Portugal recently, there was a group of children who have brought their governments to task because they are doing developments that are not in line with the Paris Agreement targets. So I think that's definitely one way of moving away from more qualitative, you know, education type of action to more quantitative action.
Amira asked a question, and top level decision makers seem to be isolated from the effects of climate change. And it's usually after the damage has been done that we find connections such as links between violence and environmental disasters. Even at that, making the case for climate change falls on the devil's ears. And playing devil's advocate, do we think it would take a major or obvious climate catastrophe to bring top level decision makers to take climate action seriously? Are you optimistic as panelists? Habiba, do you want to take this one?
So I'm a pessimist, so I'm not optimistic on climate action and climate change mitigation. I think, unfortunately, catastrophes do bring certain issues to the fore. The pandemic has brought the weakness of health systems to the fore in both the developed and the developing world. Unfortunately, by the time we have widespread catastrophe, it's probably too late to mitigate against climate change, and we need to start looking at adaptation measures. So whilst I do agree that it may bring, it may stir up the discussion, it may be already too late to have that discussion. And which is why we need to put in the work to mainstream that knowledge and that information now.
Jeremy, any questions from your end? Oh, you're muted.
Apologies, sorry. So this one comes from Aminu Usman. And essentially, I mean, just some context, the developed nations, most of whom power their economies with overwhelming use of fossil fuels, are at the forefront of climate change action and can be considered the largest contributors of climate change since the Industrial Revolution. How can such imbalance in comparison with developing Sub-Saharan nations whom still can't do without fossil fuels drive their economies be accounted for in the combined climate change mitigation action? So we're talking about global inequality, obviously between the global north and global south. And we're really trying to say, at the end of the day, there's a lack of resources. There's a need for these resources to be in Sub-Saharan Africa, I believe. But in the day, the economics, the structures in place are not there. So maybe if I can direct that at you, Habiba, if you could start on that. And I think this will be our last question. So if there's any other panelists who would like to answer after that, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
So I think that's the question that my PhD has addressed in about several hundred pages. But so I maybe can share that link. But just more generally, it is true that there is a climate equity issue. The people who are most vulnerable aren't the people that are responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions, which are the advanced economies. But one thing I will highlight, that there has been a lot of change within the technological space in terms of energy technologies, which historically were responsible for about 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. We see that renewable, cleaner energy technologies are much cheaper currently. And even within fossil fuels, coal differs from oil, which differs from natural gas in terms of the environmental damage that it brings, which is why we need to sit down and have integrated development plans that include climate action to understand to what extent we can use some fossil fuels and how we can utilize cheaper, cleaner energy alternatives in being able to achieve economic growth. I think going down the path of only those who are responsible should bear the burden or should pay will neglect some of the power dynamics on the international stage. I think I was at the COP25 in Madrid, and I snuck into one of the negotiation rooms, and you have Australia, Saudi Arabia, and a few countries essentially barring rules for climate finance creating rules that will make it more difficult for developing countries to access climate finance. So we must accept that reality to a certain extent. We must be able to look at the global landscape in terms of the mitigation and adaptation solutions that are available, and created integrated plans trying to minimize the amount of fossil fuels we need to drive industrialization or other form of development within the country. Diplomacy, just a second point now on diplomacy, I felt like from my experience at the Climate Change Conference in Madrid, COP25, African countries can do a lot better at advocating for a more equitable resources being directed towards climate action within Sub-Saharan Africa. I think 4 years in the UK or in the European Western climate action space, and Africa is always a footnote. And I think somehow they forget that there's a billion people, that need to develop. Their population's growing, energy demand's growing, and resources need to be channeled. Especially given that we are not in an economic position to undertake all the climate action ourselves. So I think there's various roles for local action, at the same time advocacy and diplomacy to ensure that those resources are channeled better towards Sub-Saharan Africa as well. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Habiba. Lots of truths there. Quick question. You said you'd like to share the link to your PhD. Will that be something that you can share with us, to share with everyone on the call?
Absolutely. So I will share it with you, and it's, I think, open access, so it can be accessed by all now.
Great. And then we'll share that on the Sustain 267 Facebook page. Thank you so much for joining us, our panelists, Amy, Angelique, and Habiba. And then now I'd like to hand over to Robin Seatal. She is the co-chair of the Global Shapers Community Climate and Environment Steering Committee, well, globally.
Hi, thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate everyone's thoughts. It was a fascinating discussion, and I know I've learned quite a bit. I was taking notes, and I'm glad that this is recorded. But thank you, Angelique, Amy, Habiba, for your thoughts and your insights. I think it's tremendously valuable, and I think as a Shapers community, we're all about collaboration, we're all about connection, and so really appreciate kind of your insights on this. And Plateau and Jeremy, thank you so much for hosting this amazing session and these series of discussions. So maybe just briefly, I'll talk a little bit about the Global Shaper Steering Committee and our goals for the next year around this topic. So we are set to have every hub in the Shaper community, so that's over 430 hubs from over 150 countries, conduct a climate and or environment related project. And it sounds like projects such as grassroots initiatives and or advocacy initiatives to address that political will, big kind of challenge, I think that was highlighted in this session as well. How do we mobilize young people in different regions to encourage the political leaders, encourage even the private sector leaders to take a more ambitious and needed stance on climate change and climate action. So we're hoping to support the Global Shaper community in every hub to conduct either a policy related or grassroots project by the next year, so by June 2021. And we're also encouraging every hub to take on a sustainability policy, which would allow them to take on a climate lens, but also integrate things like social justice. As we know, as was mentioned, I think by all the speakers, how everything is so interconnected, and that we do need to make sure that our solutions bring all of these different lenses of planetary health, societal health into the fold when we're creating these solutions. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, but thank you again so much for hosting these sessions.
Thank you so much for that, Robin. This is the end of our conversation. Please follow Sustain 267 Facebook page for information on future events. This is a 6-month project. We've done one so far. This is our second. We've got 4 more coming up. Thank you so much once again to our panelists, Amy, Angelique, and Habiba. It's been great. The conversation has been very rich. For anyone who really enjoyed the conversation and would like to share it with somebody else, this will be made into an episode on the Sustain 267 podcast that will also be shared on the Facebook page. From us at Sustain 267, thank you to our partners, the Global Shapers Community Climate and Environment Steering Committee, the Global Chair, Robin Seatel, and Kamal and Jeremy, who was also my co-host. And then thank you to the hubs that took part. So Abuja, Accra, Durban, Gaborone, Nairobi, Lagos, Victoria Hub. And last but not least, thank you to the Environmental Friendly Initiative. And the biggest thank you goes to you, the participants who gave us a whole hour of their time and participated in the conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Looking forward to seeing you again next month. And yeah, thank you and good night. Take care.
Sustain 267.